Hello and welcome to Next 2.0 on WQLN PBS NPR. Next is produced by the Public's Voice Media. I'm your host, Marcus Atkinson. If you want to know more about Next 2.0, you can go to Facebook and like the page. You can follow us on Instagram at Next 2.0 Erie. There you can keep up with upcoming show promos, events, and clips about what's next for our communities and our democracy. Thank you so much for tuning in. And now, on to the show.
They tell us these times are unprecedented, but I wonder, what would the indigenous peoples of this land say? Is this a story we've never heard, or is this just the white way playing on repeat? A government shaking the ground beneath us, is this not how our nation began? We've seen this before. When colonizers couldn't steal enough, they called the peoples here savages to justify the slaughter and stolen land. When enslaved people built an entire nation with their hands, they called their freedom a threat and answered with burning Tulsa, Jim Crow, and the school-to-prison pipeline. When queer folks dared to dance in the open, they raided and berated, beat and broke our bodies, making our audacity to exist in our truths crime. And now they say our children are dangerous, that our families don't belong, that our existence is a problem to be solved. So this is not new. This is the same story with a new name, where they turn the earth into shifting sand and make chaos so constant, so loud, that those who refuse to conform are warned, don't you dare raise your voice, fall in line, and smile. Our hands planted the seeds that grew the trees where the strange fruit hung, swaying in the hegemonic wind. But now the limbs see no color. Their hunger longs for more than melanin. And with knees pressed to new necks, we scream out, I can't breathe. We all feel it now, don't we? The fire hose of lies and policies and fear blasting at full force, hitting queer kids, Black mothers, migrant workers, hitting trans bodies, Muslim families, and disabled elders. And when we are all the target, when we are all hungry, and when all of our bodies are exhausted, where do we even begin? And this isn't new, because when chaos is the weapon, the silent surrender was always the goal. But let me tell you something they don't want us to remember, that there has never been a single time, not a single time, when Indigenous people weren't resisting, when Black people weren't rising, when disabled people weren't thriving, and when queer and trans folks weren't finding new ways to live free. Because we have never been given peace. We've only ever built it, carved it out of the violence, sheltered it within each other as we locked arms in laughter, joy, and hope. We've written survival into our songs. We've whispered revolution into the wind and hid liberation in the stories they've tried to erase. So what do we do now when the fire hose is drowning us? We do what we've always done. We root. Indigenous nations hold ceremonies reminding themselves that the earth remembers their names, that even when the government tries to erase them, we stay rooted in who we are, because they cannot erase what we refuse to forget. We build networks, the Underground Railroad, the queer ballroom scene, the migrant mutual aid groups, hush harbors where enslaved people planned their freedom. We create spaces where we are ungoverned, where we define the rules, and where we raise each other up. We collectivize. We strike. We boycott. We organize. We take what they've made to separate us, and we use it to strengthen our bonds. They say borders define us, and we say solidarity is without borders. They say gender limits us, but we say we are limitless. We tell our stories. Dictators burn books, silence voices, but truth is a wildfire. You can't stop it once it spreads. So we speak, we archive, we remember, because memory is a resistance. The goal of chaos is to make us feel alone, but we are never alone. We are the inheritors of resistance. We are the descendants of those who refused to bow. We are standing on ground that has already been watered by struggle. And so we gather, we fight, and we love. We keep each other warm in the storm, because the fire hose may knock us down, but it cannot wash away our truth. We do not drown. We rise together. And so it is. And in closing, lean in. Lean into the unknown. Lean into the discomfort. Lean into the unfamiliar. And embrace the truth underneath all the fear. Our nation has always been here, but now it's out loud for all of us to see. So look to those who've refused to be silenced and learn from them. We are not in unprecedented times, and there are brilliant leaders who know this chaos deeply and personally. So again, lean in, breathe deep, lock arms, and know the undeniable power of community. Rest, resist, repeat.
We are here today because of the sermon you all just listened to. I have been preaching for more than 40 years. I'm a good preacher. I preached some great sermons over the years. I've listened to a lot of good preachers and heard moving, powerful sermons. The sermon you all just listened to, recorded for us by Dr. Titus, may be the best sermon I've heard in person. And counting my own sermons, that's a lot of sermons. Tyler preached that a few weeks ago at a church where I regularly preach. And after the church service that Sunday, one of the women in the church said to me, Pastor Chuck, you used to be the best preacher I have ever listened to. And then with a smile on her face, she said, you're going to have to work hard to get that title back after today. Now, we're not here to parse that sermon, but to use it as a springboard. It was a great sermon because it clarified a confusing and scary moment in our lives, because it was courageous enough to name the villains in the story, because it located the current crisis that is causing so many to be afraid in our history, and because it inspired hopefulness, which is why I invited Tyler to come in and record it for us and give us a chance to talk about the current crisis that they spoke so eloquently about. Let's begin by talking just a bit about where that sermon came from. So Tyler, your own personal story, and I know a little of it, but your own personal story is the soil out of which this sermon grew. I would love for you to do a 3 to 5 minute version of your story, because one hoped for outcome of this episode, kind of humanizing of the other. So tell us a little bit about your background. How you got here.
So it's a very interesting one. And many times I'm often surprised where it leads me, to be honest. But it all started back in Titusville, growing up in a rural, pretty conservative area where my grandfather was the president of a steel union. My Nana was a teacher, my mom a nurse, my stepdad a logger who had dropped out of high school in 10th grade. And watching what happened to this city as the industry left, and my family who became foster parents when I was the age of 16, I always knew I was different than my siblings. I knew that things that seemed to come so naturally for those around me weren't clicking. And I always just seemed like one step to the left or to the right or behind. And they seemed to have a rule book that I hadn't gotten. And as I tried to, do and mirror that what I was seeing, I just found myself becoming more and more aloof. And that led me to being quite singled out by my peers. They clearly saw what I was feeling internally, but they said it out loud, and their words stayed with me, and they made quite an impact. And that led to 2 suicide attempts prior to graduating high school. And before, once I left, I got accepted into Mercier's College, and this to me Erie was just like this huge city. Like buildings were like massive, and there were so many people. And then I met some people in class who had a story similar to mine, and suddenly I wasn't alone. Right? Like And suddenly I started making sense, and all these things that just kept me to the left or to the right of my peers perfectly aligned with this other group of humans. And as they started to share the terms and the labels that they use, I heard words like queer and lesbian and gay. And then I heard trans, right? And so through their stories, I found my story, and I started to make sense to myself. And at the age of, I graduated, started working at the Office of Children and Youth, and started seeing a whole different side of the world. When I saw the foster kids in our home, I learned the system from one side, but then suddenly I was part of the system. I was in the system. And coming into that system, wanting to do the best and hoping I was helping heal, I realized that I was part of a lot of harm, that I was doing a lot of damage. And I made the decision to go back and get my master's in therapy, and I specialized in working with kids who had been removed, who were in foster care, and helping them heal from the trauma. And then over the years, as my story shifted, I started to kind of niche into this area of working with kids who not only had all these traumas, but were also queer or gender expansive. And now that I've learned a new word about myself, autistic. And so going into this neurodivergent realm. But then being a parent, I had my first at the age of 24, and then my second when I was closer to 30, and that was also the year that I came out as trans, right? So when my body was in its quote-unquote most feminine form by social standards, I learned that this is so very wrong. I've never been more sad when all this beautiful thing were happening around me. I had a beautiful house, I had a partner, I had 2 beautiful children, and I still wasn't fully getting it. Like it wasn't fully lining up. And so that's when I came out as trans. And it was when somebody else kind of called me out, like, Tyler, I think you need to talk about your gender. And I leaned into it. And then again, it was like someone opened this door, and suddenly all these things started clicking and making sense for me. My career then led to, and I did not want it to go this way, but it did, because I always said I was going to stay far away, being called out when I had said that somebody needs to do something about our failing school system, right? And so the person at the table said, well, you are somebody, and I'm like, you are right. And so I put my money where my mouth is, ran for school board, and fell in love immediately with the advocacy levels that I was then able to do. Cool. And that's kind of what built my future up from there. I had to be part of it.
You were the first out trans person to be elected to a school board?
In the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Which is kind of when you got onto my radar. I said,
I think I got into a lot of radars at that point. Some good, some not so good.
yeah. Well, mine wasn't bad. So I was curious and inspired by someone taking kind of a risk. And that's part of what your sermon was all about, is the fact that for guys like me, and I say this on this program all the time, I'm a white, male, hetero, cis, whatever we call it now. And I'm part of the most privileged group in the country. And so being able to begin to learn about these kinds of things from other people and seeing there are so many groups of people who haven't had the privileges, the blessings that I've had. And that's what your sermon really kind of focused on, and on the fact that now there's a whole lot more of us who are experiencing the kind of oppression and othering that has been going on for the people the groups that you mentioned in the sermon: Native Americans, Blacks, women, queer people. So there's some experience behind what you say, and that leads to being able to draw on that experience to help others in terms of what looks like a repressive regime developing in America. And so that's kind of what I want to do today, is kind of explore that. One of the neat things about the little church where you preach this sermon, where I preach on a regular basis, is that they allow time for discussion right after the sermon. Nobody else does that. And I fell in love with that when I started preaching there about 8 or 9 years ago. And during that discussion, in addition to all of the expressions of gratitude that people were offering up, they had an opportunity to share their fears and their anxieties. And I was reminded that you are a therapist who kind of specializes in that stuff. So maybe we can talk for a few minutes about maybe some practical strategies for combating the paralyzing fears and anxieties that lots of people are kind of experiencing these days. So what do you say to folks when you get an opportunity to sit down with them and they're expressing these fears?
So there's a couple things that I tend to offer up. Is one, and the most important at the very beginning, is to acknowledge that absolutely this is a terrifying time, and we're seeing violence on every screen. We're reading it, and it's just perpetual fear that's being relayed to us over and over and over again. And the body is a bit like a computer. It's going to take the data that it receives and it's going to respond, right? And so the brain is going to respond to the fear that's being thrown at us with more fear. There's certain parts of our brain that are going to be activated. So if we were able to hook up a bunch of little things on our brain, what we would see is that our amygdala, our animal part of our brain, is being super activated right now, and it's shifting the blood flow and turning off the logical sense of our brain, right? So we know a lot of logical coping skills. We do. We use them all the time. We hear them. We read about them in books. There's podcasts, YouTubers who talk about all of these things. But we can't access that when you're in a space of fear. You can't. You're not able to get there. And so you use the body to help the body. Doing things, and this sounds so simplistic, but doing things like forced deep breaths into the belly, and making it, that balloon shape, and then forcing yourself to do that for 2 minutes. Seeing 5 things I can see, 5 things I can hear, 5 things I can taste, if that is a safe way to do it, right? But we're trying to engage the senses at this point, to bring yourself back into the moment, into the present. One of the quickest ways to do that is by utilizing your senses. I'll tell people, like, grab a mint, and then notice how the mint feels in your mouth. Smell the mint. Let the scent of the mint travel up your nose. That pulls you into the present moment. And when you're in the present moment, it deactivates that part of our brain, and it allows us to get back to that logic or wise mind. So we have to use our body to help our body.
So one of the neat things about all of this is that what you're expressing right now is really kind of ancient wisdom.
Yes.
It's been part of a lot of traditions of indigenous peoples for a long time. And now we have science that shows that it actually works.
It absolutely
Things
works,
change
yes.
in the brain when we do these things. So breathing and focusing on sensory things makes a great deal of sense. You talked in the sermon about, and that's just like the first step.
Yeah, that's just the first part.
Kind of quieting yourself enough to get out of your fear for a few minutes. But you talked in the sermon about a number of things, 5 things maybe 6 things that you called strategies for resilience. And I want to talk about those things. You talked about, and maybe we can just kind of pop these out here and you can comment on them. You talked first about rooting. What are you talking about there when you say we root?
So there is so much history and lived experience that goes unheard or unseen or unnoticed. And so when I talk about rooting, it's finding, like, one, our core values, but also leaning into our history, right? And knowing what we have survived and what we have overcome, but building that community. When you root, you have people that you can go to, and it's not to talk about all the scary things. We can talk about those, but when you root, you have to give yourself the things that you need to survive, which laughter and joy and all the other emotions come into that. But we have to, like, make sure that we've got a safe space and we've connected with people who understand us, who see us, and are acknowledging our histories there.
Cool. So part of that is remembering that you're not in it alone.
Absolutely.
And so this rooting can't be done, I think, just alone. It requires being in community. And so we're rooting in community and in the collective memories of the community, where we can bring to the table for one another. Don't you remember?
Absolutely. There is this rugged individualism that our nation likes to hold up that is a completely inaccurate. It's infactual, right? Nobody does anything alone. We're all connected. We're all connected. From what the meals that we get to, the farmers and everyone else who's participated in that, to the grocer who has filled the shelves, right? We're all in this together. And it's not denying that we don't all have difficulties or lived experiences that have challenged us or harmed us, but it's to remember that we didn't do any of those things alone. And this nation really perpetuates that there is this individualistic approach, but we actually don't really like individuals. And so let's lean into that. Let's lean into, no, we don't. We don't like it when people stray away from what we've deemed to be the status quo and what is the right way to do it. And let's lean into our communities, because that's where the history exists, but that's where healing exists.
I find people desperate for community these days, in much more so than normal, especially since a lot of the organizations and institutions that have bolstered us over the years, community organizations, have withered. Churches, for example, don't have nearly as many people involved in them as once did. So finding your way back into community or building your own community intentionally is pretty important right now. I hear people all the time talking to me about, so alone in all of this. Well, have you called your friends?
Right.
Who are you touching base with?
And I think the social media has created, again, a false, there's a lot of beautiful friendships and a lot of beautiful connection that happens on social media, but it also can be incredibly isolating when we're just in front of a screen. And I'm not downplaying the deep connections that come from social media, and especially for those who maybe are in rural areas, and this is the safest way they can get community. But there's something that happens when you're in space with somebody. And it doesn't have to be that you're in a church or that you're in an organization. It can be in your living room, right, on the couch. It could be on a porch. It could be at a park, wherever you can find and gather.
My kid owns a coffee shop in town. And when I retired 8 years ago, I became a frequent guest at the coffee shop. It kind of became like my little office. I hear stories all the time there. There's this wonderful woman, and I use her story as an example, who I was sitting beside one day, and we just fell into a conversation, and I got to asking her herself. She is 89 years old, and comes in, always looks great. She takes care of herself. And I asked her about that, and she said, that's kind of a new thing. I've been really depressed since I lost my husband. And as the conversation proceeded, she made it clear to me. She even said, this place saved my life. I needed community when I lost my husband. I found it here. So people are finding it in all kinds of places. Taverns, coffee shops.
And Erie is full of it.
It really is.
There is a lot of strong community here, and people who are also eager to invite you into their community. Yeah. I think that there is this, again, false notion. I know I keep saying that we are a very segregated city, but we're also a very receptive.
Yeah. People talk all the time about how backward Erie is. I'm from Pittsburgh, but I've been here a long time now. I've always thought of Erie as a place that was very open, embracing to people of all kinds. So I think the Erie community has a lot to recommend it. You also talked about, as another one of the strategies for resilience, you talked about building networks. Is that related to the rooting?
It's related, but it's also thinking like a step further, right? So when for example, I'll use myself, as I'm building up Compton's Table, that's the nonprofit that is primarily focused on reducing suicidality amongst queer and gender expansive people. I know that there are other marginalized and oppressed communities who are dealing with very similar issues that we're dealing with, right? So networking and building that connection with those communities so I can be at their table, not expecting them to come to mine, but so I can go and learn about their lived experience. And now we're double in size, right? And then we're triple in size. So it's networking to know who are the other people who are in this fight with you. But then when I meet somebody at a coffee shop, now I have a name to pass on and be like, here's another community who will receive you.
Creating and gathering in spaces where we raise each other up, challenge ourselves, embrace the discomfort. These are all phrases from your sermon. Commit to each other that we will not submit, we will not look away. Compton's Table is one of those kinds of places. And I hear you saying that you see a lot of those around town now. How do you go about connecting or creating such a space?
I think the first thing we have to do is
You have to talk louder right now because our heating system just kicked in.
I think one of the first things we have to do is right away admit that we don't know everything, and to be super humble, right? And to acknowledge that it's discomfort is very different than unsafe. And it's okay to be uncomfortable. In fact, that's where all growing happens, and that's where all healing happens. Healing is not a fun process. Growing is not a fun process. They're very uncomfortable. So if we can step into that discomfort, embrace that discomfort, and allow ourselves to be incorrect, and then be open to receiving new information, there is so much beauty and so much power. The other day, I was sitting down at the bakery on 5th, and I met this brilliant human who came to our country as a refugee, and he's finishing his dissertation. And we were talking about organizing and connecting and making sure that we're empowering voices that often get left out of the conversation. And I said something, and to which he responded back, like, not everybody, is going to fight for their rights. Not everyone, because rights are not inalienable, right? They're not guaranteed. So some of us are not going to continue to engage in a battle that's someone else can just come pull things from us. Some of us are going to find our own freedom internally. And it shifted how I was thinking about this. And I was so grateful that he felt safe enough to just challenge me on the words that I was using. And what I learned in that moment let me know, like, even as somebody who's doing this work and committed to this work every day, I clearly do not know
absolutely
everything I need to know.
Right.
And so to be okay with being held accountable is a big part of building those safe spaces that I talk about.
Yeah. So embracing one's discomfort means being able to look in the mirror and see yourself through the eyes of others sometimes, so that you can take that information and use it to become better. I talk all the time about being the person God made you to be. It's kind of my milieu is the church and faith. And being the person God made you to be is a process that involves I've been preaching a lot from the Beatitudes lately. The Beatitudes are a series of principles or characteristics that we can embody, and Jesus speaks the first one in the Sermon on the Mount, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." There's a kind of humility that is required in order to be able to incarnate or enflesh all of the other attitudes he's talking about. It starts with recognizing what you just said. We don't know everything.
And good people cause harm. In fact, most harm is caused by good, kind people, unintentionally. And that's okay. It doesn't mean we're bad. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. But it's also uncomfortable to learn that you've caused somebody else harm, or that you are benefiting from systems, even if you're struggling with poverty or other things in your life, that there still may be benefits and privileges that you have that others will never have access to. And that's okay. Those things can exist at the same time.
I think I look at a lot of what's going on in the country right now, and one of the things that I think is that a lot of it's being driven by people who are small.
Yeah.
When I use that word, I'm talking about insecurity. And a lot of times that insecurity is masked by bluster and bullying, but it really grows out of a lack of an ability to see yourself, to love yourself, to feel good about yourself, which allows you then to take in new information. The person who says, "I've never made a mistake," or "I'm never wrong," you can bet that person is incredibly insecure. They need to develop, and I think this is what I think this is desperately lacking in our culture. People don't feel good about themselves. A lot of that out there that drives a lot of what's going on today. When I don't feel good about me, I'm going to make you the problem. I'm going to lay the blame on you. I'm going to find a scapegoat, because you obviously are the reason things aren't going right in my life.
And it's always so interesting to me too, is there's billion-dollar industries that are thriving on making us feel inadequate.
Absolutely.
Right? That they exist to make us want. That's how capitalism works. That's
Exactly.
how consumerism works, is we have to make you feel inadequate so that you keep buying, right? And so the industry keeps moving. And we don't teach people that it's about emotions. We don't teach people how to connect. We've kind of removed that from all platforms, and any education system. And you can see it now. And what happens when we don't center empathy or connection and we center profit, people get lost.
Yep. When it's the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
Winning and making money. That's at the forefront right now in our culture, and the culture's being called to make some decisions about that. Is that who we're going to be? In fact, it's amazing to me that I even see in a lot of churches, preachers preaching that empathy is not a Christian value. How do you think that way?
We are experiencing a litmus test on humanity.
Absolutely.
Right now.
Yeah. This is not about America. This is about our values, about our morals, and about the future of the world based on that. And one of the things I say to people all the time is, just look at human history and all of the conflict that's part of human history. What drives that? What has led to that? This lack of empathy, this smallness, insecurity, the need to be in power over other people, all of those things. You know what's not been really tried? You know what we've not built a culture on? Compassion and empathy for the other. And you get labeled as a silly idealist when you say those kinds of things. And maybe I am. And I'm okay with that. But I also know that you don't build anything that's lasting and enriching and beautiful for everyone, whether you're at the top or the bottom economically, unless you build it on those basic.
If your foundation is hate,
Yep.
and fear and ignorance, it will surely topple, because people will connect and people will share. And that is why the community and sharing our histories is so vitally important, and especially during times like these, because that is where the truth lies, and that's where the connection lies.
Two other things that kind of surfaced in your sermon. One is you talked about collective action. We strike, we boycott, we organize, which kind of goes along with the networking stuff you were talking about earlier. Where do you see that happening today, or do you?
I think that is one of the brilliant benefits of social media, and also why I think billionaires have bought out all the platforms.
I agree.
Because the way we were able to mobilize on a global level is something unlike we've ever seen before. Mm-hmm. But when we unite, and we're not going to support this industry, or we're not going to shop at this place, and we're instead going to use our money and support these business owners or these products or these values, that's the only way to hold people accountable.
Absolutely.
And when you refuse to participate in their system, and you create a new system, or you move the power to another venue, that's when people will shift. Unfortunately, that is where you see people shifting. And then you got to start all over, because then they'll figure out you're over here, and then things will happen and you shift, and then you unite and you collectivize and you strike. But when you come together and we hold to those values and those principles, you can make a lot of movement and power happen.
Yeah. One of the things I talk to people about these days is changing their habits with regard to, I tell people all the time, I love Amazon. I could very well be an Amazon addict. I love Amazon Prime. I love finding something, clicking on that and having it delivered to my house like 30 seconds later. It's crazy. Mm-hmm. But I need to be off of that, for this, not just for my sake, but for the sake of the country. Nobody should be on Twitter who gets it anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I'm working on some materials that I'm using with my network of people to replace those platforms that enrich Elon Musk and the billionaire class with other platforms. And you're right, they'll find their way to those platforms and try to take them away from us along the way. But one of the things about being smaller is that you're much more nimble. And so we'll just move to something else. But we need to stop supporting with our dollars those folks who are responsible for what's happening in our society. So boycotting and striking
And we need to create solutions for those who have multiple barriers, right? So we need to create an alternative to Amazon for people who don't have access to a vehicle, who are, who are disabled or elderly and they can't get out. And the grocery delivery from Walmart is how they get fed, right? So we need to create local alternatives to these services. So we're giving jobs to local residents, but we're empowering and taking care of our neighbors as well too. And so that's the other way you get out of this is we have to get away from these, conglomerate organizations by building local.
Yep.
By building local.
Yep. Local is the key. And it also allows us in our little communities, our local communities, to serve one another. I know a lot of retired people like myself who have some time. And so I can deliver your groceries.
Absolutely.
And we become community through doing that. We connect in ways that build us. The last thing, and this is a big one to me that you mentioned in the sermon, is telling our stories. And if you think about just kind of what's happening in our culture right now, they're trying very hard to limit our ability to tell our stories. So things like limiting the books that kids can read, book burnings, silencing voices, not allowing things to be taught in the schools having to do with the history of the oppression of blacks and queer people and women. And our truth, though, is told face-to-face, one-on-one. And I have found that telling your story, that's why I asked you to tell your story at the beginning, empowers folks, enables folks to see that they aren't alone. So what are you doing that enables people to tell their stories?
One of my, personal models is how do you be yourself if you can't see yourself? So I try to create platform or create venues or create spaces where people can be seen and so others can see their possibility, right? And so when in the positions of power, I've been very lucky and honestly very humbled to be able to get. I try to elevate other stories, right? Or at Compton's Table, we have our open mic where people can come in and they can share stories and they can play music. And you don't have to be the perfect musician or the perfect poet, but you can come in and you can just share and to be embraced in that, right? Or going on spaces like this and making sure that when I have a mic, that I'm using my privilege to point out other people's barriers and making sure that when I can, I mic pass as often as I can. So I get into the rooms, but who am I reaching back and making sure that is also sitting beside me at these tables? And that's a critical piece. And when we are able to uplift, when we are in a spot of where we are uplifted, is making sure that we are uplifting others and bringing them to the spot, and sometimes just stepping to the side so that they're the face and they're the voice that is getting heard and seen. But stories are so powerful, and I laugh because I'm immediately recalling where I hear a lot, and I'm just going to lean into a lot with the queer community. Like the older queers, they don't get it, and even saying the word queer is still a split. Like those who survived the 60s and the 70s, and especially the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, is such a bitey word, and it hurts. Like it still cuts. And the younger people having embraced and taken this back, and there's this frustration, and there's this divide. But when I ran for office, this woman popped up on my call list because she had donated to another candidate, and I spent an hour and a half. I got in trouble by my campaign for spending that long on the phone, but she was an older lesbian who had lived in San Francisco, who had been homeless and was eating out of the dumpsters, and then went on to become this person because one person encouraged her to come to a theater, and then she joined the choir, and then she built this business. But her story was so powerful, and hearing what she had to do and survive and exist and break down so that I could even be on the other end calling her and saying, hey, I'm running for this office. I would have never been able to run for office had this woman refused to live in her truth. And I think we miss those connections too of the power of our ancestors and the stories and how those stories make way for the new stories to come up. And how do we connect all of those?
Yeah. And I would say to the demographic of which I am a part, those who have experienced pretty much the heights of privilege in our lives. Our job is to bring people to the table and step aside, give them a chance to tell their stories, and not feel like our story is the only thing that matters, or it has to be story. The story has to fit in a little narrow paradigm of the kind of people that are acceptable in this culture.
And to embrace the word privilege is not a bad word. There is so much power and things that we can do when we embrace privilege, right? When we are able to acknowledge that, yes, we have gone through some horrible things, and also this one barrier was not added on. I am a trans person and I am still white, right? I am a palpable trans person, and I know that. I can get into most spaces, and most people don't know my story unless I decide to tell them my story. Yeah. Well, locally, a lot of people, just because it's everywhere. But there's so much power I have with this privilege. It is not dirty, and it is okay to acknowledge it and to accept it, and then to do something with it.
And understand the context in which you're talking about these things. You and I can talk about that privilege here. There are a lot of places where, when I preach, for example, I don't talk much about privilege, but I do talk about how incredibly blessed, how lucky I have been.
Yes.
So I'm not speaking words that trigger resistance, but acknowledging.
Right, you have to meet people where they are.
Yeah.
And you have to step into their space.
Yeah. And giving them an opportunity to embrace the fact that they have been lucky. They have been ultimately privileged without all of the baggage that oftentimes goes with that word. So a little bit at a time, slow progress here and there, but we keep on fighting. And so I'm so glad that I heard that sermon and that you came in today to talk to us.
I'm very grateful for this, for the opportunity to share. And I genuinely hope that any part, even if it's just one part, resonates with anybody, but that we come down to, it's about community, it's about connection, and knowing we are not alone.
So in the show notes for this show, folks, you will have an opportunity to have contact information for us here at Next, and for Dr. Titus. And I may even provide some transcript of what we talked about today, because there's some parts that I want to encourage people to put into practice in their own lives. So stay tuned for that, folks.
Thank you.
That's all for our show today. Tune in next time for more discussion and analysis with local and national guests. Remember that Next 2.0 streams on Fridays on all major podcast platforms, and the fourth Sunday of the month at 4 p.m. on WQLN PBS NPR, which is 91.3 FM. If you want to leave a message, comment, or suggestion for the show, call the Next hotline at 814-240-8816. We look forward to hearing from you. I am Marcus Atkinson. Come and join us again so that you can hear about what's next for our communities and our democracy. Peace.